The American underworld of the mid-20th century was a place where fear and fascination lived side by side. Neon lights and jazz clubs distracted most people from the quiet power that pulsed beneath the surface. But behind every sparkling skyline lay an intricate network of mob families who pulled the city's real strings. In Chicago, New York, and eventually the wide-open deserts of Las Vegas, organized crime wasn't just a set of street hustlers. It was a shadow government with its own code, courts, and deadly consequences for anyone who broke the rules. To understand how the Mafia became an empire, you have to look beyond the headlines of shootouts and bank robberies. The real story was a cold, calculated business. It was about territory, silence, and influence that reached all the way from corner bars to judges' chambers. And in this hidden hierarchy, two men would rise to become symbols of power and terror: Tony Spilotro and Vito Genovese. Though they operated in different eras and on different stages, their lives tell a single story about the evolution of American organized crime. Genovese, born in Italy and hardened in the immigrant neighborhoods of New York, would quietly turn the Genovese crime family into one of the most formidable forces in Mafia history. Decades later, Tony Spilotro would take the mob's reach to the glittering casinos of Las Vegas, enforcing its will with a mixture of charisma and cruelty that left both gamblers and gangsters trembling. The seeds of their power were planted in the rough streets where young immigrants learned that survival meant bending the rules or breaking them outright. For many families, the promise of the American dream collided with harsh realities: low wages, dangerous work, and prejudice. Criminal networks filled the gap, offering protection, money, and a sense of belonging. In neighborhoods where law enforcement looked the other way or was bought off, the Mafia became both a safety net and a predator. Children who grew up watching these men command respect understood that fear could be a powerful currency. By the 1920s and 30s, Prohibition turned bootleg liquor into the ultimate business opportunity, and the Mafia seized it. Illegal distilleries and speakeasies made millions overnight. Politicians and police officers were bribed. Rival gangs were eliminated. Violence was a cost of doing business, and those who could kill without hesitation rose quickly. This was the crucible that forged Vito Genovese. He wasn't loud or flashy, but he was ruthlessly strategic. The kind of man who could stand behind a smiling handshake while planning a silent assassination. Across the country, Chicago had its own notorious syndicate, and decades later it would produce Tony Spilotro. Born in 1938, Spilotro came of age long after Prohibition, but during a golden era of mob control. He watched older gangsters operate with near-total impunity, and learned that fear and loyalty could outweigh any badge. While Genovese relied on calculated diplomacy, Spilotro embodied something more volatile: a street-level enforcer whose reputation for sudden, brutal violence made him indispensable. What linked these men was a shared understanding of the Mafia's most sacred principle: omerta, the code of silence. Betray it, and you vanished. Honor it, and you could rise from the back alleys to unimaginable wealth and influence. Genovese and Spilotro may have been decades apart, but they mastered the art of leveraging silence and fear to build empires that the law struggled to penetrate. Their rise was also fueled by America's own contradictions. The same country that celebrated freedom and opportunity often looked the other way when crime brought money and excitement. Politicians accepted campaign donations with no questions asked. Businessmen enjoyed the profits from mob-run unions and construction projects. Casino owners welcomed the steady flow of cash from organized crime, as long as the chips kept spinning. The Mafia thrived not because it was hidden, but because it was entangled with the very society that claimed to oppose it. As the neon lights of Las Vegas began to glow in the desert and the docks of New York bustled with illicit shipments, Tony Spilotro and Vito Genovese stepped onto a stage already prepared for them. Each would become a godfather in his own right, One, a cunning puppet master manipulating international drug routes and political alliances. The other, a ruthless enforcer who turned Las Vegas into a mob playground. Their stories are not just about blood and bullets. They're about ambition, survival, and the dark genius of men who understood that real power isn't always visible. The rise of Tony Spilotro and Vito Genovese shows how organized crime could burrow so deeply into the heart of America that, for decades, it seemed unstoppable. Vito Genovese grew up in an era when immigrant families struggled to find their place in the crowded neighborhoods of New York. He arrived from Naples as a boy and learned quickly that muscle and money often spoke louder than laws. By the time he was a teenager, he had already aligned himself with local gangs, working small hustles and running errands for more seasoned criminals. What set him apart wasn't just fearlessness, it was patience. Genovese understood that the most dangerous men weren't the ones waving guns on street corners. They were the ones who could bide their time and strike when no one expected it. During Prohibition, while many mobsters chased fast profits and notoriety, Genovese quietly built alliances. He worked under the legendary Charles "Lucky" Luciano, absorbing lessons in organization and strategy. He helped manage the flow of illegal liquor and kept a keen eye on emerging opportunities. Violence was never far from his toolkit. Stories circulated of cold-blooded murders ordered to remove rivals, but Genovese preferred subtle manipulation to open war. He cultivated politicians, bribed police officers, and wove a network of influence that reached deep into the city's institutions. His reputation as a calculating figure only grew after the repeal of Prohibition. When many mobsters saw their fortunes shrink, Genovese pivoted smoothly into narcotics trafficking, gambling, and union control. He realized that heroin was far more profitable than alcohol ever was, and he built international connections to secure a steady supply. Ships carried drugs from Europe and South America, and his network moved them through American ports with shocking efficiency. This wasn't the chaotic street-level dealing that most people imagined. Genovese operated like a corporate executive, coordinating logistics, ensuring discipline, and enforcing absolute loyalty. One of his boldest moves came in the late 1930s when he fled to Italy to avoid a murder charge in the United States. Rather than lying low, he embedded himself with powerful figures in Benito Mussolini's fascist government, providing black market contacts and amassing wealth. During World War II, he maneuvered cleverly, offering assistance to the U.S. military once the Allies invaded Italy. For a time, it seemed he could play both sides of any conflict, always finding a way to turn chaos into profit. After the war, Genovese returned to the United States and resumed his climb. By the 1950s, he had effectively taken over the family that now bears his name, even though he preferred to let others carry the title of boss to deflect attention. His real breakthrough came when he orchestrated the infamous 1957 Appalachian Meeting, a secret summit of more than 100 mob leaders meant to unify the Mafia's national strategy. The gathering backfired spectacularly when law enforcement raided the site, exposing the scope of organized crime to the public. Yet, even that disaster failed to stop him. Genovese maintained control, using intimidation and careful planning to keep his operations profitable. For law enforcement, he was an enigma. Witnesses disappeared, evidence crumbled, and informants stayed silent, terrified of the consequences. The Code of Omerta worked in his favor, shielding him from prosecution for years. When the government finally managed to convict him on narcotics charges in 1959, many believed it was the only way they could remove him from the streets. Even in prison, Genovese remained a figure of immense influence, directing operations and settling disputes through loyal intermediaries. What made Vito Genovese truly dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, it was his ability to think 3 moves ahead of everyone else. He turned the Mafia from a collection of neighborhood gangs into a transnational enterprise, proving that organized crime could function like a global corporation. His mix of patience, ruthlessness, and business acumen created a model that other mob families would follow for decades. ensuring that his name remained synonymous with the cold, strategic heart of the American Mafia. Tony Spilotro's world could not have been more different in setting, yet the rhythm of his rise followed the same mafia beat. Born in 1938 to a hard-working Italian-American family on Chicago's West Side, Tony grew up surrounded by the quiet presence of organized crime. His parents ran a small restaurant that attracted neighborhood wise guys, and young Tony absorbed the unspoken lessons of power and respect long before he ever carried a weapon. School held little interest for him. By his teens, he was running petty scams and showing a taste for violence that set him apart from his peers. The Chicago outfit, the city's dominant crime syndicate, noticed his boldness early. Spilotro proved himself as a reliable soldier who would do whatever was necessary to protect the outfit's interests. He was small in stature but intimidating in presence, with eyes that could chill a room. By the late 1950s, he was already known for brutal enforcement, collecting debts, running shakedowns, and sending unmistakable messages to anyone who challenged the mob. Street reputation mattered, and Tony built one that made people think twice before crossing him. When the outfit began moving serious money into Las Vegas, Spilotro's particular talents became invaluable. Las Vegas in the 1970s was a glittering frontier for organized crime. Casinos flush with cash, regulators susceptible to bribery, and endless opportunities for skimming, the quiet theft of profits before they reached the counting room. The bosses needed someone who could protect their investments and keep other predators at bay. Tony was their man. In 1971, he was sent to the desert under the guise of a casino worker, but everyone in the underworld knew his real mission was enforcement. Once in Vegas, Spilotro set up a small empire that went far beyond watching the casino floors. He formed the notorious Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, a crew that specialized in high-end burglaries and robberies. They broke into jewelry stores, homes, and businesses by literally cutting through walls, leaving almost no trace until the loot was gone. The profits were huge, but the audacity drew attention from both local police and the FBI. Spilotro, however, seemed untouchable for years, aided by a network of insiders and a reputation for punishing anyone who talked. His methods were not for the faint-hearted. Stories of his violent discipline spread quickly, enemies beaten in broad daylight, suspected informants disappearing without a trace. Associates knew that betrayal meant not just death, but a painful one. That aura of fear kept his crew loyal and competitors at bay. Yet the same brutality that secured his power also planted the seeds of his downfall. As federal surveillance increased, every public act of intimidation gave investigators more evidence and more determination. Spilotro's personal life added further complications. He became involved with the wife of Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal, a prominent casino operator tied to the outfit. The affair infuriated Rosenthal and unsettled Chicago bosses who valued discretion above all else. At the same time, the FBI steadily tightened its grip, flipping lower-level gang members and documenting the gang's burglaries and assaults. Each arrest and wiretap chipped away at the myth of invincibility that had once surrounded him. By the early 1980s, pressure from law enforcement and tension within the outfit reached a breaking point. Chicago leaders, worried that Spilotro's recklessness would bring federal heat onto their entire operation, began to see him as a liability rather than an asset. Rumors swirled that he might turn informant or that his ego had grown beyond control. For men who lived by the code of silence and obedience, such suspicions were as dangerous as any police investigation. Despite the storm closing in, Tony Spilotro refused to retreat. He continued to run his Las Vegas rackets and planned new heists, convinced that his reputation and connections would protect him as they always had. But the desert city he once dominated was changing, and the outfit's patience was wearing thin. In the secret councils of Chicago, a decision was being made. The enforcer who had once guaranteed their profits might now have to pay the ultimate price. Spilotro's violent rise had made him a legend. The forces gathering against him were about to make him a cautionary tale. The power and peril of both men became clearest when you look at how alliances and betrayals shaped their worlds. For the Mafia, loyalty was a currency more valuable than gold, yet it was never guaranteed. Vito Genovese built his empire on carefully chosen partnerships, but he was equally ready to discard anyone who threatened his dominance. He had once been a trusted lieutenant of Lucky Luciano, yet when the opportunity arose, he quietly maneuvered to push Luciano aside and claim greater control. Associates who stood in his way often met sudden, unexplained deaths, reminders that a smile from Genovese could conceal a death sentence. Behind the genteel meetings and polished suits was a man who treated friendship as a temporary business arrangement. Tony Spilotro's alliances were forged on the street and hardened by violence. In Las Vegas, he worked closely with his brother Michael and a tight-knit crew who trusted him with their lives. But fear was the glue that held them together. The hole in the wall gang thrived on shared risk and the promise of quick wealth, yet even among his own men, Tony maintained an edge of menace. He rewarded loyalty with money and protection, but he punished mistakes brutally, ensuring that no one ever forgot who controlled the game. Those who whispered to law enforcement knew the price: disappearance, or worse. Both men understood that secrecy was the lifeblood of organized crime. Omerta, the Mafia's code of silence, was not just a tradition. It was a survival strategy. For decades, it allowed Genovese to dodge indictments and Spilotro to run Vegas rackets, while the authorities struggled to find witnesses brave enough to testify. But secrecy could only last so long. Federal agents began to infiltrate their operations using wiretaps, undercover informants, and the Witness Protection Program. Each betrayal struck like a hammer, exposing layers of corruption and violence that shocked the public and weakened the myth of the untouchable mobster. Betrayal came not only from informants, but from within the Mafia itself. Genovese faced his own reckoning when rival bosses and former allies decided he had grown too ambitious. Some historians believe that key figures quietly cooperated with federal prosecutors to bring him down on narcotics charges, removing him without open warfare. He was convicted in 1959 and sent to prison, where he remained a commanding presence until his death in 1969. But the family he built carried his name and methods long after. Spilotro's fall was even more brutal. As the FBI closed in and casino profits came under scrutiny, Chicago outfit leaders began to view him as a dangerous liability. His high-profile burglaries, love affair with a boss's wife, and growing arrogance convinced them he could no longer be trusted. In June 1986, Tony and his brother Michael were lured to a meeting in Illinois under the pretense of a mob discussion. Instead, they were beaten and buried in a cornfield, a silent verdict from the very organization Tony had served with ruthless loyalty. Their downfalls exposed the fragile nature of power built on fear and silence. Genovese tried to rule like a chess master, but even the best strategist cannot control every piece forever. Spilotro thrived on intimidation, yet intimidation only works until allies decide the risk is too great. Both men proved that the Mafia's greatest threat has always come from within: ambition that outgrows the family and loyalty that bends under pressure. In the end, their lives illustrate a dark symmetry. One relied on quiet calculation, the other on overt violence, but each believed he could outmaneuver fate. Both were brought down not just by law enforcement, but by the very networks they helped create. Their stories remind us that in the Mafia, every alliance carries a hidden knife, and every betrayal is only a heartbeat away. The final years of their stories reveal how power, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually collapses under its own weight. Vito Genovese spent the last decade of his life behind bars at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, but even there he continued to exert influence. Inmates and guards alike knew that his word carried authority. He arranged meetings, approved decisions, and kept a firm grip on the Genovese family through trusted lieutenants on the outside. Yet, prison slowly eroded the aura of invincibility that had shielded him for so long. By the time he died of natural causes in 1969, he was a man whose empire survived, but whose personal freedom and health had been claimed by the very system he once mocked. Tony Spilotro's end was far more violent. After years of skirting federal charges and shrugging off surveillance, the Chicago outfit decided he had become too reckless. The hole in the wall, gang's burglaries had drawn national attention, and his affair with Frank Rosenthal's wife created rifts that mob leaders viewed as unforgivable. In June 1986, Tony and his brother Michael were called to a supposed meeting in Bensenville, Illinois. Believing it was a chance to smooth things over, they went willingly. Instead, they were ambushed by fellow mobsters. Both were beaten to death and buried in a cornfield, a grim message that no one, no matter how feared, was beyond the reach of mafia justice. Their legacies, however, continue to echo. The Genovese crime family remains one of the most structured and secretive of the 5 families of New York, a testament to the systems Vito built. His emphasis on discretion and long-term planning shaped how organized crime operates to this day, with modern bosses adopting corporate-style management and keeping a low profile to avoid the spotlight that once doomed so many of their predecessors. His life proved that brains could be as lethal as bullets, and that power often hides behind a quiet smile. Spilotro, meanwhile, became a cultural legend of a different kind. His brutal reign in Las Vegas inspired books, documentaries, and even films like Casino, where Joe Pesci's character was modeled after him. The stories of his daring burglaries and violent enforcement have become part of the city's dark folklore. He symbolizes the glitzy yet dangerous intersection of organized crime and the casino boom, a reminder that beneath the flashing lights of the Strip once lurked a ruthless underworld. Together, their stories form a cautionary tale about ambition and the temporary nature of criminal power. Genovese demonstrated how far cunning and patience could take a man willing to manipulate politics, exploit international connections, and instill fear without raising his voice. Spilotro showed how intimidation and raw force could carve out a kingdom in the neon desert. But both men ultimately discovered that the mafia's code offers no permanent protection. Every alliance can fracture, every secret can surface, and every enforcer can become expendable. Their falls also reshaped law enforcement strategies. The high-profile exposure of the Appalachian meeting after Genovese's orchestration pushed federal agencies to create new organized crime units and pursue the RICO Act, which later became a powerful weapon against mob families. Spilotro's brazen activities in Las Vegas spurred tighter regulation of casinos and closer cooperation between state and federal authorities, helping to drive the mob out of the gambling industry. Today, the names Vito Genovese and Tony Spilotro stand as symbols of an era when organized crime seemed unstoppable, when mobsters could sway elections, run global drug trades, and skim millions from casinos while living in plain sight. Their empires rose through fear, strategy, and an uncanny ability to read both allies and enemies. Yet their endings, one in a prison cell, the other in an unmarked grave, underscore the ultimate truth of the mafia world. No matter how high you climb, the fall is inevitable.